The US is infamous for its two-party nature. Between the Electoral College and the first-past-the-post system used in its legislative elections, the Constitution as it stands is set up to favor that duopolistic partisan structure. In addition, the president is easily the most powerful man in D.C. due to a number of factors, including the character of our founding fathers as people. The president is, in effect, the executive, party leader, and a key legislator due to the fact that the presidential candidate set the tone for the campaign and the party's goal. It's generally accepted that the president has the popular mandate and Congress is just along for the wild ride. A president who can't control his party is seen as a bad president by outsiders and most of his contributors. Despite this, there has been a general interest in a parliamentary America, one where Congress calls the shots, not the man in the White House. On some level, this is probably due to fatigue at our current political system, but I am a little baby channel and want to avoid that like the plague. So instead, I'm going to find a different way to our goal. Namely, Washington only serves one term. It's somewhat downplayed nowadays for reasons I'm sure you can figure out, but Washington did not want to be president. He was begged to, quote-unquote, run for re-election, air quotes because who would go against him, by Hamilton and Jefferson. If they don't convince him, he retires in 1792. And if he retires in 1792, then a couple of things happen. Firstly, the political supremacy of the presidency is almost inherently weakened going forward. Only one president ever broke Washington's two-term precedent, FDR. Roosevelt, however, only ran for that fateful third term due to the fall of France in World War II, which probably doesn't happen here. But regardless, Washington sets a one-term limit, meaning that the president has a lot less clout over the legislature. It's a lot harder to be a functional party whip when you're looking at politically forced retirement after the midterm. And most presidents would be. Coalition building is a lot harder, and frankly, the president's job is harder no matter what. Secondly, prior to the 12th Amendment, the VP was the runner-up in the election. This had funny electoral hijinks already, but early Republican politicians had a wonderful fear that the president and vice president would be from opposite parties. This wouldn't be fixed until 1804. This only happened once in 1796, but I can imagine it happens in 92 and possibly again in 1796. John Adams wasn't exactly popular, but Jefferson's strict interpretation tendencies make it hard for me to believe he would call for an amendment. Now, I do think that the executive would mount a valiant political power struggle with the legislative, and it does have some advantages. It's a unifying figure for a majority party, and by controlling legislative appointments to the cabinet and judges, they do still have some constitutional power at their disposal. However, with a shorter conventional term, they will struggle to excite an audience and be as instrumental in guiding a party as they were in our timeline. As a result, I think that the currents of populism and political dissent will naturally move toward the legislature, especially if multiple elections result in the split executive, and this will only get worse as the Federalist Party declines and the Democratic Republicans split into nationalist and regionalist factions. Once that process begins, and I don't see why it wouldn't, the Federalists only had one proper presidency, it wouldn't be the president controlling the party, it'll be the Speaker of the House, who does not have political inertia against long terms. I suspect it would be the Speaker and not the Senate Majority Leader for two main reasons. Firstly, while the Senate has its part in the legislative process and is seen as the quote-unquote upper house, it drew its authority from the states, not the people. That makes it a bit difficult for this era's liberals to really lean on it for Republican rule. Secondly, the Senate has an executive. It has its own president even. The vice president, in fact. That means that moving the center of government to the Senate either gives it to someone with no official special power, remember political parties are a symptom of our system not designed into it, or the vice president, part of the lame duck executive in this timeline. And frankly, that position does not command respect in the Senate then or now. Thus, the Speaker of the House, despite having to run every 2 years, is the likeliest outcome. This pseudo-parliamentarianism has a few consequences. While the Virginia dynasty at large wouldn't exist as we know it, or perhaps more accurately wouldn't matter as much, I would argue that the US will have an even stronger bias toward the South in government. The South during this time was the more populated region, even while the North was concentrated into cities, and this was reflected in the makeup of the House of Representatives. This means that tariffs and internal developments would be more hotly debated for longer. However, I do think the overall political course of the country would be similar, albeit with a few less alien and sedition acts. They massively expanded the power of the presidency, which obviously wouldn't work here. Now, those of you who know about the second party system are probably thinking that the Whigs would love this. Henry Clay was probably the most influential congressman of the 19th century, after all. But here's the problem. The Whigs coalesced in opposition to Andrew Jackson and his administration. With a weakened presidency and 20 years of parliamentary supremacy, if Jackson wants to go into politics, he goes to the Senate or the House. While it's likely he scoops up his like-minded followers anyway, with a 2-year term, it's a lot harder for him to have an age of himself without becoming speaker, which would not go to a relatively freshman politician in this world. I also think that parties would be a lot less stable and a lot more regional. Firstly, we see this in places like Britain and Canada. While Canada's parties are rather entrenched, they do have about 5 consistent ones that usually squeak in some federal seat, or Britain's 4 to 5 between the Conservatives, Labour, Reform, Liberal Democrats, and the SNP. The US's sheer size means that this quasi-spoiler will be very common from the beginning, and while I think it would stabilize and crystallize into a few larger parties with the little weird ones on the fringe, I do think that even by 2024, the US would have a lot more diverse party counts in the House of Representatives. Jumping back to the 1800s, I think that the party system that would emerge from the collapsing Democratic Republicans would be similar but distinct from the one in our reality. I imagine that the Whigs would be around in some form, but weaker, with their southern wing being independent of the organization. Northern Jacksonians probably form into something like the Democratic Party, but the radical fire eaters are also separated from them. The Free Soilers are probably also kicking off sooner. Let's say there's a Mexican-American War. At this point, the regions are similar enough in population, and the Cottonwigs would coalition with the pro-expansion factions of the Liberals and Democrats, I guess. The Southern Party and the Democrats. The jerks and the less jerks. We'll go with that. Now, like I've stated, I think that things would go similar enough from then. It's during the war and after that I'm interested in. If the South secedes over an anti-slavery speaker, then the North have a lot less time to win the war. This is actually very likely to see the Confederates, or whatever analog they have, win. But in addition to that, this is when I think the parties would start trending towards having less staying power. Let's say the Confederates win. Since they only have to hold out until what would be in our world midterm, there sure as hell won't be a Republican Party or even a Freedmen's Party, since slavery would likely survive a few more years. This obviously stunts civil rights for a while, and this is when I think the cracks in the parliamentary system would be at their deepest. However, I don't think that the president that quote-unquote led the country during the Civil War could be the one to change it, and the conservative, anti-free soil backlash would stunt reform efforts for years. Absent a Republican Party or analog, who fills the void? Well, for one, a Catholic party, mostly German and Irish, focused on cultural issues surrounding Catholic immigrants, of course. Expect fierce competition with the Prohibition Party, which will likely be part of a broadly right coalition, despite otherwise being somewhat progressive. During the Gilded Age, I would expect to see a lot of single-issue parties like immigration, corruption, or prohibition, but I think they'd eventually fall into a broad national party surrounding the labor question. We'll say that by 1900, the Workers' Party of the US is in competition with the Liberals, who are derived from the Jacksonians. The WPUS would have come about similar to Labour in the UK or the Populists in the US, a rejection of the largely business-friendly conservatives that would have dominated the Gilded Age by workers' unions, socialists, and other workers. There's probably another war between the US and CSA at some point, but it's kind of hard to say how or when. My gut instinct for narrative is World War I, but again, kinda impossible to say. Especially if the CSA only has to hold out for 2 years versus 4. But the Union would absolutely crush them in most circumstances by that point, likely taking Tennessee and northern Texas. This would probably be when you see an actual Freedmen Party, and a pro-Confederate white Protestant party. Those ballots would be awful. Lots of political violence around that area. But if you've made it this far, please consider subscribing for new alternate history videos every week. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of the video. Now, by the modern day, politics would be unrecognizable. Firstly, one of the largest parties would have evolved from almost overt socialists, while the right will be defined by Jacksonian populism. I would also expect that the House would be much, much bigger. Since it's more powerful, almost any voting reform would be focused on making it more representative. In addition, I think that the Senate might be reduced to a rubber stamp a la the president. Not necessarily intentionally, but if the power of government is centered on the House of Representatives, the other house vetoing something will look really bad very quickly. In fact, I could see the South seceding much earlier because of that reduction of senatorial power. But that throws everything impossibly out of whack. By modern day, I think the actual political parties would largely have crystallized to about 5 or 7 consistent ones. Now, to be clear, this is a work of fiction. All of these parties are based on political trends and factions I've seen in the US and in parliamentary democracies, like the US is in this fictional scenario. Do not take any of this as an endorsement or denunciation of these fictitious parties. The Workers' Party USA would be the Labor or the Liberals, or I guess the Democrats. The mainstream left, so to speak. I don't think they'd be as big on social issues as the Dems, but expect welfare states and income taxes. I'll be honest, I don't know if they'd be pro or anti-free trade and tariffs, since that niche would traditionally be filled by the Jacksonian liberals, but avowed socialists would also likely lean into internationalism that doesn't usually work with protectionism. By the 2020s, they'd probably be more like social democrats. The liberals, like I've mentioned a few times, would be the right wing of the party, born from Jacksonian democracy or whatever takes that spot here. They're the free trade, property rights, and small government party. You know, liberals, like classical liberals, not are the gays people liberals. Socially, however, I do think they'd largely be conservative. But I think it would be more of a secular general welfare thing, being anti-drug because drugs are poison, not because of some degradation of tradition. In contrast, I think the Family Values Party would be our social rightists, based more on what we'd call the religious right. However, I don't think that this party would actually be that successful. It would be further right than the liberals, with a greater tendency toward radicalism and moralistic rhetoric. Although, funnily enough, if the Confederate States go the way they probably do, I do think the FVP would be highly nativistic toward the southern border. So that's consistency, I guess? To the left of the modern version of the WPUSA would probably be the progressives or the socialists or something similar. Maybe labor. These guys would be your progressives, your AOCs, and your Bernies. It's hard to say if this party lasts, if it broke off during some Great Depression, or if it's just some recurring thorn in the WPUSA's side, since there's always been attempts to challenge the Northern Democrats from the left, but they rarely worked in real life. And in this scenario, it worked until the challenge became the establishment. The last party I think would consistently place is the Catholic Party. They'd generally be akin to the liberals, but with a greater emphasis on immigrant issues. Economically, I think they'd be prone to division. The German steelworker has different economic needs than the Irish fisherman or the Mexican farmhand who travels back to Mexico every 4 years. I think they'd be a weird blend of drawing light on traditional racialization problems and flaws in immigration, while still being conservative on internal social issues like the Second Amendment. The newest kid on the block, and by far the smallest, would be the Greens. You know them. They're the Greens. Degrowth, free trade, anti-nuclear, probably the least changed from our world. If you like the video, please consider subscribing for new alternate history content every week, and tell me who you think you'd vote for in the comments.